analogy from economics that I'm using is what economists call externalities. Externalities or spillovers are either negative or positive, but they are the unintended benefits of some economic transaction or process. So when a corporation makes a factory that's making tires, but they're dumping toxic waste into the river, and the river flows downstream, and the people living in the town, now their water becomes contaminated, and they start getting birth defects and these things. These are a type of externality. There's other positive externalities, like when your neighbor puts in some kind of fire installation in his house, and that's going to be a benefit for the neighbors, because if a fire does start and it's put out by the house, the other houses aren't burnt down as well. So economics recognizes these unforeseen consequences of some economic transaction. In religion, we have externalities as well, and we don't like to think about them. But one of the externalities that so many of our religious traditions seems to constantly produce is spiritual pride. Spiritual pride. It's an unintended product of the idea that I have something that other people don't have, and it makes me better than those people. I'm saved and they're not. That's a very hard thing to believe about yourself without having some type of contempt for the other person. It's not necessary. There are people that do believe that and don't have contempt for other people, but very often it leads to contempt. Another externality that comes from religion, particularly in our current crises, is the way that Muslims, and I'm going to talk about Muslims within my own tradition, the way that Muslims view those outside of their faith in terms of misunderstandings of their religion. And I'm going to give you one example. Most Muslims, if they hear Christians say God loves everybody, they say, not in our religion. He only loves Muslims. Every Muslim knows that. In fact, he hates everybody else. Because God says in the Quran, لا يحب الظالمين. He doesn't love oppressors. And if you're not a Muslim, you're obviously an oppressor, because the Quran also says, إِنَّ الشِّرْكَ لَظُلْمٌ عَظِيمٌ. Associating with other than God is a great oppression. And these are the type of logical conclusions that Muslims make about other people. That for me was a problem until I read a mawqif by Amir Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, in which he said, many Muslims falsely assume that God doesn't love everybody. But God does love everybody with his universal love, embodied in the verse, رَحْمَتِي وَاسِعَتْ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ. My mercy encompasses all things. And mercy is an act of love. Mercy emanates from love. And then he said, but there is universal love that God gives to everybody, and then there is specific love that he gives. And he said, when God says, I don't love oppressors, that is not his universal love, that is his specific love. Oppressors are still enveloped in his universal love. And then he said there is a love even that transcends that, which is the love that God has for the elite of the elect. And he said these are people that embody the first type of love. And he said this is the hardest love. It is to love everyone for the sake of Allah, because they are a creation of God. And they have a potential within themselves to know God. And this is so beautifully embodied in the hadith in al-Bukhari, when the Prophet ﷺ saw a Jewish funeral passing and he stood up. And Muslims know that standing up is something that the Prophet discouraged. He stood up. And this is in the soundest recorded hadith that we have. And one of the companions said, it's a Jew, O Messenger of God. And this was a time when there was animosity between the Muslims and the Jews in Medina. And he looked at him and he said, أَوَلَيْسَتْ نَفْسَ? Isn't it a soul? Isn't it a soul? He was honoring that thing that transcends Jewishness, that transcends Muslimness, that transcends Christianness. It's that thing that every single human being that is breathing is emanating. And that is that it is a living soul infused by the divine itself. That is the reality that the Prophet was acknowledging. That the human soul is something that only God knows its reality. You can't judge any individual because only God encompasses the knowledge that would enable us to do that. Now, religion in some ways can be looked at like, for me, a nuclear reactor. It's a reasonably clean energy. It has the power to illuminate households. But it has this toxic byproduct. Now, historically, the way that toxic byproduct tended to be dealt with was what we would call regulation. So you have actually standards by which you regulate the religion. One of the things that has happened in the modern world is that, and this doesn't mean that there weren't egregious errors in the past. There certainly were, and I'm not going to go into those. But generally, normative religion articulated the faith in a way that enabled people to understand those elements of their religion that without that, they could become incredibly harmful to themselves and to others. Now, the only way that you can regulate is to have an enlightened scholastic class that has authority and is recognized. People that understand the book. If you read St. Augustine on Christian, he's got an extraordinary essay about the necessity of knowing the liberal arts before you read the Bible. If you don't know what a conditional sentence is, you could get in serious trouble reading the Bible. And this is a major problem that we face now in the Muslim world, because we have people for the first time in Islamic history reading the Quran for themselves without the interface of an authoritative scholastic class that could show them how when you read "kill the polytheists wherever you find them," that doesn't mean kill the polytheists wherever you find them, because there are other verses in the Quran that regulate that verse. There are hadiths and traditions that regulate that. This is so important for religious people to understand, because once you open up these books, it's like giving plutonium to people out there. Handing plutonium over to people and let them do what they want with it. Now, the only other way that you can control this is through a recognition of secularity. And that is what this country has done. It attempted to regulate the problems of religion that are inherent in religious traditions by creating a neutral force that enabled these religions to interact with each other, but the playing field was equal. And America has been reasonably successful at this enterprise. And that is why we're in an extraordinary situation right now where an Orthodox Christian from California could convert to Islam, go to the Middle East, study the Islamic tradition, come back and lecture at a Christian college in a lecture series called the Ghazali Lecture Series. Only in America. Because that is what this enterprise was about. But unlike European laicism, which is what we see in France, I wrote a little essay called Pourquoi la Burqa? Only in laicism, which is to exclude religion entirely from the public space. This is a different form of secularism. It is not the secularism of America. But these, as far as I can see, are the only two ways in which religion can be seriously regulated. Because without these two forms, religion is a disaster. It's not a solution to the problems. It is actually part of the problem, if not the root of the problem in many cases. Because the world has always been a problematic place. And when you have people that want to solve the world's problems, and they are convinced that they're sanctioned by God, whether they're a president or whether they're a man in a cave, when they believe that they're sanctioned by God to do those things, they can do the most heinous things in their misguided belief.